In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire the world had ever seen. Its navy ruled the seas. Its currency ruled global trade, and its confidence seemed to rule history itself. But behind the closed doors of power, something terrifying was happening. The British Empire, rich, proud, and seemingly undefeated, was quietly running out of money. No enemy army had crossed the English Channel. No bombs were falling on London. Yet Britain was bleeding financially, day by day, shipment by shipment. And the one man who would decide whether the empire lived or collapsed was not a king, not a prime minister, not even a general. He was an American banker. His name was J.P. Morgan. This is the hidden story of how World War I turned Britain into a client, how money became more powerful than armies, and how a financial trap quietly reshaped global power forever. Stay with us until the end, because what happened next still controls the world you live in today. When the guns of August roared to life in 1914, Britain was ready for a fight, but not this kind of fight. The conflict quickly bogged down into trench warfare, a brutal industrialized meat grinder that consumed men, machines, and most of all, money. Every bullet fired, every shell launched, every uniform stitched had to be paid for. Britain's industrial might was impressive, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. More steel from Pittsburgh, more grain from the Midwest, more oil from Texas. They needed America. The problem was, all of this had to be paid for in U.S. dollars, and Britain's gold reserves, the bedrock of its empire, were draining away at an alarming rate. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith and his government faced a nightmare scenario. They couldn't stop buying American goods without risking defeat on the battlefield, but they couldn't keep buying them without risking national bankruptcy. The British pound, once the undisputed king of currencies, was teetering on the edge of collapse. If international confidence in the pound disappeared, the entire imperial financial system would crumble. Britain was desperate. They needed a loan, a massive, unprecedented line of credit. And for that, they had to turn to one place, Wall Street. Enter John Pierpont Morgan, Jr., head of the most powerful bank in the world. The British government, the ruler of a quarter of the globe, had to go, hat in hand, to a private American citizen. Morgan wasn't just a banker. He became Britain's exclusive purchasing agent and financier in the United States. He organized a syndicate of over 2,000 American banks to loan Britain hundreds of millions of dollars. It was the largest foreign loan in history. In exchange, the House of Morgan took a commission on every single transaction. Britain was saved from immediate collapse, but at a staggering cost. It had effectively mortgaged its future. This wasn't just a business deal. It was a seismic shift in global power. For the first time, a private American bank held the fate of the British Empire in its hands. Morgan had to ensure the pound sterling remained stable, not just for Britain's sake, but to protect his own massive investment. His bank intervened in currency markets, buying up pounds to prop up its value. Think about that. The financial stability of the world's greatest empire was now being managed from an office at 23 Wall Street. The center of global finance was quietly crossing the Atlantic from London to New York. By the time the United States officially entered the war in 1917, the transformation was nearly complete. Britain had gone from being the world's biggest creditor to its biggest debtor. America, which had been a debtor nation before the war, was now the world's primary lender. The U.S. government took over the loans to the Allies, but the underlying dynamic was set. The dollar had dethroned the pound. The torch of global leadership, carried by Britain for a century, had been passed. It wasn't won on a battlefield with soldiers, but in the backrooms of banks, with ledgers and loans. This financial shift didn't end in 1918. It defined the rest of the 20th century and continues to shape our world today. The dominance of the U.S. dollar, the power of American financial institutions, and the economic architecture of the modern world all have their roots in this secret financial war. The empire that ruled the waves was ultimately sunk by a tide of debt. It is a powerful reminder that the true levers of power aren't always wielded by armies or governments, but sometimes by the quiet, unseen hand of finance. In August 1914, church bells rang out across Britain, not for a wedding, but to announce the start of a war. In the streets of London, people didn't mourn. They cheered. They waved flags, sang patriotic songs, and celebrated what they believed would be a short, glorious conflict. Young men, filled with visions of adventure and honor, rushed to enlist, convinced they would be home by Christmas. It was a carnival of patriotism. But inside the stone walls of the British Treasury, there was no cheering. There was only a cold, creeping fear. The men who managed the empire as finances understood a brutal truth that the crowds in the streets did not. War, unlike patriotism, doesn't run on spirit. It runs on money. And Britain, the mightiest empire the world had ever seen, was about to learn that empires don't always fall to armies. They fall to debt. You see, Britain had built its vast, global empire on a foundation of trade, not stockpiles. It was the world's workshop, its banker, its shipping hub. But it didn't hoard resources. It imported half its food, most of its raw materials, and crucial components for its industries. The coal that powered its factories, the steel for its ships, the very weapons and ammunition for its soldiers. Much of it came from across the Atlantic. Every single bullet fired on the Western Front had a price tag. Every uniform, every ship, every loaf of bread that fed a soldier depended on a complex web of foreign suppliers, especially American ones. This was the empire's hidden vulnerability. At first, the solution seemed simple. Britain would pay its way. It would pay in gold. And so it began. Heavily guarded ships set sail from British ports, their holds filled with wooden crates packed with gold bars. They slipped through the dark waters of the Atlantic, dodging German U-boats, on a one-way trip to the vaults of New York. Each shipment felt like tearing another brick out of the empire's foundation. Clerks at the Bank of England watched in silence as the gold vaults, once overflowing, began to empty. Bankers whispered increasingly urgent warnings. The nation's lifeblood was draining away. But the war didn't care. The war always demanded more. By 1915, less than a year into the conflict, the gold was almost gone. The situation was becoming desperate. British factories, magnificent as they were, simply could not keep up with the war's insatiable hunger for steel, explosives, and machinery. The front lines were a voracious beast, consuming men and material at an unimaginable rate. Letters from soldiers at the front described the grim reality: shortages of everything. Artillery batteries were rationed to just a few shells per day. Generals, furious and desperate, sent frantic telegrams back to London, demanding more guns, more shells, more of everything. Back in the Treasury, the numbers told a terrifying story. Britain, the financial center of the world, the empire on which the sun never set, could no longer afford to fight. The cheering crowds of 1914 had faded into a distant memory, replaced by the grim mathematics of bankruptcy. The war wasn't just a struggle against Germany anymore. It was a race against financial collapse. And across the ocean, in a quiet office in New York City, one man was watching this entire unfolding drama with meticulous care. His name was John Pierpont Morgan, Jr., head of the most powerful bank in the world. J.P. Morgan did not wear a uniform. He didn't salute flags or sing patriotic anthems. But he understood something the generals and politicians in London and Paris did not fully grasp. Modern wars are won by credit long before they are won by courage. As Britain's gold ran out, it had only one place to turn: Wall Street. And Wall Street meant Morgan. The British government, in a move of desperation, appointed J.P. Morgan & Co. as its official purchasing agent in the United States. This was a pivotal moment in world history. Suddenly, every rifle, every artillery shell, every ton of steel, every rail car of supplies destined for the Allied war effort had to pass through the ledgers of the Morgan banking empire. Morgan's bank wasn't just lending money. It was organizing the entire Allied supply chain. It decided which American companies got the contracts, negotiated the prices, and arranged the financing. What began as financial assistance quietly, insidiously, became dependence. British officials, proud representatives of a global empire, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to ask, not demand. They traveled to New York, hat in hand, to negotiate loans with American bankers. They had no other choice. If Morgan and his syndicate of bankers decided to stop extending credit, the war would grind to a halt. A flow of ammunition, food, and raw materials would stop. The Allied armies would be disarmed, starved, and defeated, and Morgan knew it. Every new loan was another link in the chain. Each signature on a contract subtly shifted the balance of power from the banks of the Thames to the skyscrapers of Wall Street. The British Empire, which had financed wars and kingdoms across the globe for centuries, now needed permission from a New York banker to survive. Its sovereignty was being pawned, piece by piece, in exchange for the means to keep fighting. The numbers were staggering. By the end of the war, the Allies had borrowed billions of dollars, an amount unimaginable just a few years earlier. Britain was no longer just fighting Germany. It was caught in a financial vice. On one side was the enemy, and on the other, its own spiraling debt. The empire was bleeding out, not just on the fields of Flanders, but in the accounting books of New York. The war had exposed the fragile financial underpinnings of its global power, and this was only the beginning. The decisions made in these desperate years would reshape the world, leading to the decline of one empire and the unstoppable rise of a new global power. The 20th century was supposed to be Britain's century, but debt was rewriting the script. Thanks for watching. If you found this story of power, money, and the hidden mechanics of history as fascinating as I do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. We'll see you in the next video. World War I wasn't just a story of trenches and tanks. It was a silent financial takeover, a moment when an empire's fate was decided not on the battlefield, but in the quiet, wood-paneled offices of Wall Street. And at the heart of this story is one man, J.P. Morgan, Jr. Imagine this. It's 1914. Britain, the master of the world, a global empire on which the sun never set, declares war on Germany. Everyone thought it would be over by Christmas. But Christmas came and went. The war machine demanded more shells, more guns, more food, more everything. And it all had to be bought from somewhere. That somewhere was America. At first, the arrangement was simple. Britain, with its vast wealth, placed massive orders with American factories. Steel, grain, explosives, the orders were staggering. To manage this unprecedented flow of goods and money, Britain needed an agent, a financial powerhouse they could trust. They turned to J.P. Morgan and Co. It was the biggest contract in history. Morgan's firm became the sole purchasing agent for the entire British Empire in the United States. Think about that. One private bank was now controlling the supply chain for a world war. Initially, Britain paid in gold. Giant ocean liners, dodging German U-boats, secretly ferried billions of dollars worth of gold bullion across the Atlantic to the vaults of New York. But the war machine was insatiable. It devoured money faster than Britain could ship gold. Soon, the gold ran out. This is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Britain, the world's banker for over a century, had to start borrowing. And who did they borrow from? The American public through J.P. Morgan. Morgan's bank orchestrated massive bond sales, called Liberty Loans, encouraging ordinary Americans to lend their savings to the Allied cause. Posters screamed, "Buy a bond and help our boys." But really, they were funding Britain and France. By 1916, the situation was desperate. Britain was no longer just asking for money. It was begging. Interest payments were piling up. American suppliers, getting nervous, started demanding guarantees. And J.P. Morgan stood at the center of it all, not as some cartoon villain, but as a cold, calculating realist. He understood something powerful. The future of global finance belonged to America. Behind the scenes, in those quiet meetings, the terms got tougher. Morgan demanded collateral. Britain was forced to sell its overseas assets. Railways in Argentina, bonds in Japan, investments across the globe, pieces of its empire were liquidated, sold off to keep the war going. British officials were horrified. They felt utterly humiliated. Here was the British Empire, pawning its crown jewels to its former colony. But they had no choice. The alternative was defeat. The numbers are just staggering. By the time the United States officially entered the war in 1917, Britain had already borrowed billions. The financial balance of power had irrevocably shifted. America wasn't just joining the fight. It was arriving as the banker of victory. And bankers always collect their debts. When the armistice was signed in 1918, the world celebrated. Parades filled the streets of London. People cheered the heroes who had won the war. But beneath the surface, the British economy was shattered. The nation that once ruled the world's markets was now drowning in debt owed primarily to the United States. The consequences were swift and brutal. The British pound, once the world's dominant currency, began to weaken. New York, not London, was now the undisputed financial capital of the world. The scepter of economic power had crossed the Atlantic. J.P. Morgan didn't need an army to conquer Britain. He did it with ledgers and loan agreements. And the real tragedy? Most people never even noticed. They saw the victory parades, they heard the patriotic speeches, but they missed the silent transfer of power happening in bank vaults and boardrooms. Britain had won the war, yes, but America had won the future. This story teaches us a powerful, timeless lesson. Power doesn't always fall with a loud explosion. Sometimes it changes hands quietly through contracts, debts, and signatures on a piece of paper. World War I proved that money can outlast empires, and finance can shape the course of history more profoundly than force. The world we live in today, with the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency and New York as the center of finance, wasn't an accident. It was forged in the desperation of war, the moment Britain signed those loans, believing they were a temporary measure to survive. They weren't temporary. They were the price of victory, and the cost was an empire. It's a sobering reminder that a nation that loses control of its finances, no matter how powerful its armies, ultimately loses its freedom. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more hidden histories. See you next time.